right. Can you see me, Larry?
I can, Scott. Yes, I can.
Excellent.
Great. Yeah, I took my video off because it's distracting. I have to let my charm carry the day, not my good look. I'm joking.
No, I know we only got so much to work with, Larry.
Yeah, well, you gotta do what you gotta do, right?
It's 12 o'clock, so we will get started.
Okay.
This is the summer intern lecture series. So those of you in attendance, please mute your microphone, and we will be recording this presentation. And I'm Scott Kirk, and I'll be the host of the series, and I manage the environmental compliance and waste characterization departments at the Savannah River site for Savannah River remediation. And this is our third of 5 lectures that we will be addressing a variety of different topics related to the profession of health physics. Last week, we listened to Margaret Severa share her professional experience and the requirements for physical security of disused sealed sources and other types of radioactive materials as established by the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Because of this pandemic, most of you are aware that we have expanded the SRR Summer Intern Lecture Series to beyond the Savannah River site to include other young professionals and student interns at Georgia Tech, Clemson, the University of Alabama, and Colorado State University, and others across the DOE complex. And I heard that last week we welcomed some young professionals from DOE's Office of Legacy Management from Grand Junction, Colorado, and I hope you all enjoyed last week's presentation. This week's lecture is about the management of radioactive waste in the United States. I can tell you as a health physicist, a geologist, and an environmental scientist studying the fate and transport of radionuclides in the environment using highly sophisticated probabilistic softwares like GoldSim, which are really needed to predict radiation doses to members of the public thousands of years into the future. That's been an extremely rewarding profession of mine. And I can tell you that the intersection of radioactive waste management policies, public acceptance, and the political influences pose additional challenges that are often more difficult to surmount than the technical issues. Now, one thing that people often forget about is that nuclear technologies, they continue to evolve and significantly enrich the quality of life. And with the evolution of these technologies, even though it's enabled our society to diagnose medical illnesses without the need for invasive surgeries, treat cancers, conduct research, develop new kinds of pharmaceuticals, preserve our food supply, and generate over 20% of our nation's electricity from commercial nuclear power plants, these technologies also generate a radioactive waste that poses a threat to public health and safety. And these materials need policies, they need regulations, so that we can adequately protect public health and safety. This week, I want to welcome Mr. Larry Camper. Larry is the former director for the Division of Decommissioning, Uranium Recovery, and Waste Programs for the United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I've known Larry for over 20 years. He's a good friend of mine, a professional colleague, and he also served as a former regulator, providing federal oversight for several projects that I've been involved with. Larry was most active in shaping the ever-changing world of managing low-level waste over the past 15 years, especially at a time in 2008 when the disposal options for Class B and C waste were effectively stranded in 36 states because the state of South Carolina rightfully and understandably chose to restrict access to only the generators in their compact. Larry was also involved in a rulemaking for the disposal of large quantities of depleted uranium, which is highly technical on its own. And this is a part that led to a most significant rulemaking changes since 10 CFR Part 60 was promulgated in 1982. Larry also directed his staff to do waste determination reviews under his consultation role under the 2005 National Defense Reauthorization Act of 2005 at the Savannah River site here. Your contributions there, Larry, were phenomenal, very well appreciated. And Larry, I remember sitting in your office in 2005, and we were discussing the roles and jurisdictions and authorities between the intercity and agreement state for regulating the disposal of greater than Class C waste. Now, these discussions led for a petition for rulemaking that I helped file in Texas, and it started a very important conversation and even a rulemaking change that continue to this day regarding finding a disposal options for greater than Class C waste. And this is a waste stream that's been effectively stranded for 40 years. So that's a tremendous accomplishment from you as well, Larry. Larry also served for 10 years as a U.S. representative to the Waste Safety Standards Advisory Committee to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, Austria. He also served as the group chair of the Office of General Committee during the fourth review meeting for the Joint Convention on the Safety of Spent Nuclear Fuel Management and on the Safety of Radioactive Waste Management at the IAEA. The Joint Convention is an international treaty to which the United States is a contracting party. Larry received his Bachelor of Science degree in Radiological Sciences and Administration in the School of Medicine and Healthcare Sciences, and an MS degree in Administration in the School of Business, both from George Washington University. Larry's expertise and experience is tremendous, and so what I will also do, in addition to forwarding everyone copies of this presentation, I'll send his bio. So we really hope that today that you enjoy Larry's presentation, and without further ado, introduce Mr. Larry Camper. Larry, it's yours.
Thank you, Scott. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Good, thank you. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for taking time from your busy schedules to be here today. When Scott asked me to do this, we talked about what to cover, and we focused upon the low-level waste program, which I'll go into in some detail here. And I have designed this to be a primer. I recognize that some of you may know this in some great detail, and some of you may not know it at all. So I tried to find a spot where the porridge would be not too hot or not too cold, and maybe just right. So it is a primer. On this first slide, which is just a brief intro of me, I would mention two things. I'm glad, Scott, that you mentioned the IAEA, because one of the things that we try to do in the low-level waste program is to coordinate with the IAEA. In my role on the Waste Safety Standards Advisory Committee, I was able to help take part in developing standards, which is regulations and guidance for the IAEA, and bringing to bear our experience here in the United States. And of course, then we learn from other countries as well. The Joint Convention is important, that Scott mentioned, because what happens is every 4 years, we put together every 3 years, we put together a national report on our entire waste program, and that is subject to peer review by our contemporaries in other member states. And frankly, I will tell you in all candor, these other member states really look closely at our program, and we look closely at theirs. And so it's a wonderful way of getting feedback from international colleagues on the quality of the waste program. And it covers the spectrum of waste in the United States, not just low-level waste. But thanks for mentioning the Joint Convention and the Waste Safety Standards Advisory Committee, because those were important roles that I enjoyed very much. So we're going to talk about the low-level waste regulatory program. And that is a focus upon the commercial disposal of low-level waste and the operation of commercial disposal sites. Now, I will mention, and I know that there are some folks from DOE, some summer interns, I understand. And oh, by the way, I want to mention, I'm so glad that the summer interns are taking part in this program, because you are the future of this industry. And what we can share with you and inform you hopefully will help your careers, because years from now, we'll be reading about you, and someday one of you will be doing this. So your involvement is simply phenomenally important. I would mention that we're going to talk about the commercial side, which is regulated by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but there's another entity out there called the Department of Energy, which also has a huge role in the disposal of low-level waste. The Environmental Management Program of the DOE has been successfully remediating a number of sites around the United States. It handles its waste a little bit differently. It in some cases disposes of waste on site, in situ disposal, if you will. In certain instances, it also uses the Nevada site for some of its waste, but it also uses commercial disposal. So for those of you who want to know more about DOE, you can look at DOE Order 435.1, which will tell you a lot more about the DOE program dealing with remediation and waste management. So in the United States, we have several categories of waste. We have high-level waste, which is spent nuclear fuel, or waste resulting from weapons production and the like, high-level waste. We have low-level waste, which is Class A, Class B, and Class C waste. We have something known as greater than Class C waste. Greater than Class C waste is simply that which is in excess of Class C. We have very low-level waste, although very low-level waste is not defined in the regulatory space. There are some working thoughts about what is low-level waste. I'll talk about this a little bit more later in the presentation, but note for the moment that it's not defined. Much radioactive material is held for decay and storage. A classic example is medical facilities and universities decay a lot of their waste in storage. We do have effluent releases that come from operating facilities. These are liquid and air, and they're controlled by standards set forth in 10 CFR Part 20. And then solid waste is evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Some of it is staged for decay and storage. Some of it is shipped out under certain regulatory provisos. But today we're going to focus upon low-level waste. So the organic statute for the NRC authority is the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, and that act also includes authorities and responsibilities given to the Department of Energy. I would draw your attention to the third bullet here, which points out that NRC, under the Act, the Atomic Energy Act, the AEA, is assigned authority to regulate commercial uses of radioactive materials. And so that means that the NRC, in addition to regulating waste disposal commercially, also regulates nuclear power plants, production facilities, enrichment facilities, and the like. Now, states may enter into agreements whereby the governor of the state signs an agreement signed by the chairman of the NRC to regulate possession of source, byproduct, and small quantities of special nuclear material. These are known as agreement states. And today, interestingly enough, there are 4 commercial low-level waste disposal facilities operating in the United States, and they're all regulated by agreement states in the states of Washington, Utah, South Carolina, and Texas, with Texas being the most recent one operated by waste control specialists in Andrews County, Texas. So important to note that all 4 are regulated by agreement states using regulations and guidance that have been developed by the NRC, which I'll talk more about in detail. Another big piece of legislative information to be aware of is the Low-Level Waste Policy Act. The Low-Level Waste Policy Act, which was issued in 1980 and then subsequently amended in 1985. Now, the 80 Act and the 85 Act came about as a result of issues and problems that were occurring in a few operating low-level waste disposal facilities in the late 60s and into the 70s. There was a site, for example, Maxey Flats in Kentucky, West Valley in New York, Sheffield in Illinois. There were some problems with these sites, and the governors were quite concerned about it. And they implored the Congress to do something about that, to put in place a set of better regulatory criteria so these low-level waste disposal sites could be regulated properly to protect public health and safety. Now, in the 80 Act, the states were given responsibility for developing low-level waste sites, and they did this by developing compacts. And the idea is that in a compact, there would be a host state, and those compacts were actually allowed to exclude waste from other states that are not a member. They got a typo there, from. And it didn't go quite the way Congress wanted it to. So in 1985, Congress passed the amendment to the 1980 Low-Level Waste Policy Act to try to put in place more incentives for the states to proceed to develop compacts and host sites. Also in those acts, the federal government was given responsibility for addressing the disposal of greater than Class C waste. And then in 1987, the Department of Energy issued a document whereby it assumed responsibility on behalf of the federal government for the disposal of greater than Class C waste. During the same period of time, between 1980 and 1985, in 1979, the NRC started working on its regulation that became known as Title 10 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 61. That went into effect in 1982, and it is the regulatory part that we use today to oversee the safe disposal of low-level radioactive waste in the United States. The agreement states that regulate the 4 facilities have regulations that have to be compatible and adequate as compared to 10 CFR Part 61. I would point out that the NRC does continue to provide oversight through a program known as the Integrated Materials Performance Evaluation Program, or lovingly known as IMPEP, whereby every 4 years the NRC will review the agreement state programs to determine that they are in fact adequate to protect public health and safety, and that they are compatible, consistent with the compatibility requirements associated with the given part of the regulations in Part 61. This has worked very well. There's what's called a non-common indicator within that process known as IMPEP, whereby the NRC looks at the actions taken by the state, looks at the adequacy of their program, their staffing, content of the regulations, and so forth. So while the agreement states regulate the disposal facilities using their regulations, which are essentially tantamount to Part 61, the NRC continues an oversight role via the IMPEP program. So where does low-level waste come from? There's approximately 20,000 users of radioactive material, including approximately 100 nuclear power plants. I think it's a little bit less than 100 today. But a lot of people don't realize just how many users of radioactive material that there are in the United States. We have 20 nuclear power plants that are undergoing decommissioning. They will be generating a great deal of Class A waste, small amounts of Class B and Class C waste, and a very small amount of greater than Class C waste through the reactor internals activated metals. We also have dozens of previously contaminated commercial sites undergoing remediation. We refer to those as complex material sites. And there was a time when there were many of these sites, but now they're down to just a few, fortunately. And all of these generate low-level waste that require safe disposal. So what is this stuff called low-level waste? Well, interestingly enough, we often refer to it as what it's not. It is not spent fuel. It is not high-level waste. It is not transuranic waste, but I want to make a point about that in a moment. It is not mill tailings coming from uranium mining. It is not NORM, naturally occurring radioactive material, or even NARM, which is accelerated radioactive material, or it's not accelerated produced, and that's regulated by the states. But on the transuranic waste for a moment, you won't find transuranic waste within the definition set forth in Part 61.2. That's been an issue of some concern of late. But what you will find in the waste classification tables, there is some transuranic waste included in the waste classification table. But by definition, it's not in Part 61, therefore it's not low-level waste. It includes radioactive waste produced during the operation of nuclear reactors and enrichment facilities. There are many users of radioactive materials, hospitals, industry, and universities, for example. And then, of course, the cleanup and decommissioning of sites no longer operating, whether it be done by a commercial entity or by the Department of Energy. So for a low-level waste disposal facility to operate, it must have a license. It must be given a license by the Commission or an agreement state acting on behalf of the Commission through the delegated authority. And the requirements are set forth in Title 10, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 61, entitled Licensing Requirements for the Land Disposal of Radioactive Waste. Emphasis there is land disposal. Interestingly enough, it focuses upon near-surface disposal. That's within the top 30 meters of the surface. Some performance objectives are set forth in Part 61, which I'll cover in a moment. It sets forth a number of technical and financial requirements. There's an important role for performance assessment in the Part 61 regulatory process. It makes use of a waste classification scheme, which is really the cornerstone of our waste disposal regime in the United States for low-level waste. And a dose standard is specified in Part 61, which I'll cover. So in terms of the purpose and scope of Part 61, it establishes for land disposal those procedures, criteria, terms, and conditions upon which the Commission issues a license for disposal. Now, I pointed out that the Commission to date has not issued a license for a disposal facility, but the Commission has the regulatory infrastructure in Part 61. It has the guidance documents. It has the environmental impact statement. And all of those things are used by the agreement states in issuing a license for an operating disposal facility. And as I said, the last one that started operations was a waste control specialist facility in Andrews County, Texas, which Scott, by the way, had a lot to do with. It does not apply to the disposal of spent nuclear fuel. That's handled entirely differently. You probably are familiar with what's been going on for the last many years on Yucca Mountain, which was supposed to be the repository for spent nuclear fuel. Today, there's some efforts going on trying to develop 2 interim consolidated storage facilities for spent nuclear fuel, and it does not include uranium, thorium, tailings, or other waste. I mentioned earlier that it was developed in response to problems of operating low-level waste disposal sites in the 1970s, and there were some problems. There really were some significant problems. The governors were quite concerned about it. And the agreement states, of course, have adopted similar regulations for low-level waste disposal. In many cases, their regulations are almost whole cloth, Part 61. But depending upon the level of compatibility assigned to a particular component of Part 61, the regulations may or may not be identical or essentially identical. Now, in addition to the waste classification scheme, which we'll talk about, there are 4 performance objectives in Part 61. And these performance objectives must be met by the applicant for a license to operate a facility, and then, of course, during operations and even in post-closure. The first of those performance objectives is protection of the general population from releases of radioactive material, with limits being set forth for exposure in Part 61.41. There is a protection of individuals from inadvertent intrusion anytime after institutional controls are removed. And the institutional control period post-operations is 100 years. And that is set forth in 61.42. There's another performance objective dealing with the protection of individuals during operations according to the criteria, which is set forth in 10 CFR Part 20, and those are the standards for protection. And that's set forth in 61.43 in Part 61. And then the last of the performance objectives is the stability of the disposal site post-closure. It's important to note that in the beginning, up front, there's a lot of criteria that has to be satisfied in Part 61 for the suitability of a site. Not every site is suitable for a low-level waste disposal facility. So there's a lot of suitability requirements. There's a lot of operation requirements. And then, of course, there are stability requirements post-site closure. So those are the 4 performance objectives, another cornerstone of the Part 61 regulatory process. The dose criteria in Part 61. The first bullet points out that any member of the public should not exceed 0.25 millisieverts, or 25 millirem, to the whole body, 0.75 millisieverts to the thyroid, or 75 millirem, and 0.25 millisieverts per year, that's 25 millirem, to any other organ that maintain fluid releases, ALERA, as low as reasonably achievable. Now, the NRC has an operating policy that 25 millirem per year total effective dose equivalent is the limit. And that's become an operating policy that the NRC has been using for a long time. But note that the criteria in the first bullet actually goes way back to ICRP 2, International Commission on Radiation Protection 2 criteria, which is quite dated at this point. So the ongoing rulemaking effort, and Scott mentioned this in passing in his commentary, there's an ongoing rulemaking before the Commission right now to make a number of changes to Part 61. And while that rulemaking was initiated way back in 2007, 2008 to address the issue of the disposal of large quantities of depleted uranium, one of the things that the staff has done in that proposed rulemaking is to propose that the criteria in the first bullet be changed to 25 millirem total effective dose equivalent, TEDE, so that we have modernized that dose standard. And as I said, this is under Commission review at this time. Part 61 has a lot of requirements, frankly. There are specific technical requirements that have to be satisfied. There is 61.13. And it is the role of the performance assessment that is conducted by the staff to ensure that those technical requirements are met. There's a number of design requirements for the disposal site that have to be met. Of course, financial assurance has to be satisfied, and financial assurance is one of those cornerstones of all NRC regulatory processes. There are financial assurance requirements for decommissioning, the financial assurance in place when you're operating. And so just like those facilities, the same applies for a disposal facility. Financial assurance requirements have to be satisfied. And they're rather detailed. I mean, we could do a session alone on the financial assurance requirement. But again, this is a primer, so bear with me. There are requirements for the low-level waste facility operation and site closure, and also for environmental monitoring. And I would point out on the environmental monitoring that when an applicant seeks a license to operate a disposal facility, baseline environmental information has to be provided. You know, hydrology, tectonic issues, and so forth. And then during the course of operations, there are requirements for environmental monitoring. And similarly, in a post-closure mode, environmental monitoring must also continue. Now, the waste classification system, which is set forth in Part 61.55. We could certainly talk about this for an hour, but I'll try to touch upon it at least just briefly. What it does is it identifies concentrations of radionuclides that are generally acceptable for near-surface disposal. Call it screening values, if you will. If your waste, as verified through measurements and documented in a shipping manifest, meets the concentration limits that are specified in the two tables in Part 61.55, then the waste may be disposed of in a near-surface disposal facility. Now, this classification scheme was derived from what's known as impacts analysis methodology, where you're looking at a detailed evaluation of the waste streams of concern, the evaluation of the site in great detail, and then it brought to bear what was known at the time, in the 1970s, but of course performance assessment has continued to be refined, and so modern performance assessment methodologies are brought to bear as well. And fundamentally, it's based on the idea that low-level waste would decay to innocuous levels within a few hundred years. And the fact of the matter is, if you look at most of the waste that makes up the low-level waste regime, you'll find that it's gone. It's decayed in 100 years. But the criteria in Part 61, and I encourage all of you, by the way, to go look at Part 61 separately from this and look at some of this in much more detail than we have time for today. But the criteria in those waste classification tables and the analysis that takes place for a site considers out to 500 years for Class C waste. So, but fundamentally, most of it goes away in a short period of time, i.e. 100 years. It does include protection of an inadvertent intruder with a 500 millirem per year implied dose, not specified dose, which is higher than the 25 millirem I cited earlier, and that's based upon a lower probability of occurrence. And it was deemed to be an accidental event. One of the things that the Part 61 ongoing rulemaking before the Commission now is to move to have the 500 millirem per year dose for an intruder become specified in Part 61 and not only implied, as is the case currently. The classification scheme in the two tables, tables 1 and 2, address short half-life, and long-lived radionuclides. And these are concentration values. If you go look at the tables, you'll see a radionuclide, you'll see a concentration value specified, and you'll see some qualifying language just below the table that tells you whether it's Class A, a B, or C, and that way you can look to determine what class of waste it is. Class A waste is usually segregated from other waste unless it has been stabilized in a manner similar to Class B or even Class C waste. But normally, Class A waste requires much less stringent requirements for disposal, and therefore it is segregated, unless stabilized, and can be integrated with higher classes of waste. Then, of course, the regulatory criteria is increased for the various classes of waste, Class A being the least restrictive, Class B being next, Class C being the most pressing in terms of regulatory requirements. For example, Class C waste cannot be disposed of any closer than 5 meters to the surface of the disposal facility, as an example. And then, of course, there is also intruder barriers, engineered barriers for preventing intrusion with consideration up to 500 years for Class C waste. So it is a risk-informed, performance-based approach with requirements ranging from Class A to Class C, increasing in the stringiness of those requirements. So that's the waste classification scheme briefly, but the Part 61 waste also has to satisfy a number of characteristics. Can't be disposed of in cardboard or fiber boxes. And by the way, there was a time when it was, many years ago. Liquid waste should be solidified or absorbent material should be used. The liquid content is less than 1% by volume. There can be no toxic gases, vapors, or fumes. It has to be non-pyrophoric. Fires are not good. Gas pressure must be less than 1.5 atmospheres, and activity cannot exceed 100 curies in the package. Now, these things all probably seem to be fairly intuitive when we look at them today, but again, remember that this is not how it was done in the late 60s and 70s. And so that's why these kinds of requirements came to be. Hazardous, biological, pathogenic, infectious material must be excluded or treated to the extent practicable. There are waste stability requirements, and quite a few waste stability requirements. And again, stronger for C than for B and then for A. Waste form, waste processing, and container structure requirements that provide stability are specified. And then the inadvertent intruder must be protected, and that was assumed to be 500 milligram per year. And that was driven primarily by calculations that were done under the impact analogy method, driven by cesium-137, which most of you know, I'm sure, is a high-energy gamma emitter. And so it had a lot to do with deciding what those values were in the waste concentration tables to protect that inadvertent intruder. And by the way, the inadvertent intruder was assumed to take place. So if we kind of look at the requirements and summarize or conclude, it does establish procedures, criteria in terms of conditions to issue licenses for the disposal of. Again, the fundamental issue is that there must be a license in place, and these requirements must be met in order to operate that facility. We now have many, many years of operating experience in the disposal of low-level waste using Part 61. We know that it ensures protection from releases of radioactivity of the general population and the environment, and it protects an inadvertent intruder and individuals during facility operation. We now know that based on all these many, many years of operating experience. It does ensure the long-term stability of the disposal site after closure with custodial care. I mentioned earlier there's a 100-year institutional control period. The operating licensee is obligated for the first 5 years post-closure to continue to be involved, and then it goes to the custodial agent, which is either a federal or state entity. It uses a risk-informed approach to demonstrate compliance. And of course, Part 61, or a very close proximity or approximation of Part 61, is used by all the agreement states that operate the 4 commercial disposal facilities in the United States. Land ownership and institutional controls is another one of the key issues. It's important that the facility be safe during operations, but also post-operation. And so the disposal is permitted only on land owned in fee by the federal or state government. The institutional control requirements include physical control of access to the site, environmental monitoring, as I mentioned earlier, periodic surveillance, minor custodial care. And it says minor custodial care because remember, it's a very static environment at this point. Nothing's coming in, it's now stabilized by the design criteria, by the suitability requirements. So it only requires minor custodial care. But there may be other requirements imposed by the Commission or the agreement state acting on behalf of the Commission for a given site that must be maintained. The landowner has to administer funds to cover the various costs associated with institutional controls. And again, 100 years is the period which those institutional controls must be in place. Financial assurance requirements, I mentioned this earlier, but it's also important again just to point out that financial assurance requirements must cover the operational life of the facility for all the license activities as well as the cost and construction of waste disposal. These funds must be available for site closure and stabilization when the license is granted. In other words, you've got to have your financial assurance in place to get your license, and it is reviewed by the NRC or the agreement state periodically. Funds must cover the cost of decontamination, dismantlement of facility structures, and cost estimates on commission-approved site closure plan. Every site has a site closure plan. Binding arrangements for securing the funds for monitoring and maintenance during the institutional control period. There are a number of different ways in NRC regulations that financial assurance can be ascertained and maintained. But arrangements for those mechanisms must be in place throughout the institutional control period. So Part 61, not surprisingly, does rely heavily upon performance assessment methodology. Performance assessment involves the systematic analysis and modeling to address what can happen at that site, how likely is it to happen, and what are the resulting impacts, and how the impacts compare to regulatory standards. And I can tell you, and I know Scott knows firsthand himself, that the performance assessment process for a low-level waste disposal facility is indeed a complicated and sophisticated process that the applicant must provide and ensure it is maintained over time, and the regulator takes steps to ensure that as well. It must demonstrate an acceptable methodology to demonstrate compliance with the 4 performance objectives that I cited earlier, set forth in parts 61.41 through 61.44. Continuing with a couple more comments on performance assessment. Obviously, it involves the site description and characteristics, including the engineered barriers. It includes an analysis and modeling of events that are likely to affect long-term facility performance. It contains a description, analysis, and modeling of processes controlling movement of radionuclides from the low-level waste disposal units into the environment. It is well known and understood in performance assessment spaces some radionuclides are mobile. Some are more mobile than others. And that all has to be evaluated, and the facility has to be designed accordingly, depending upon what materials will be there, how much will be there, what packages they will be in, and so forth. It involves an analysis of impact scenarios and modeling computations to workers, potential intruders, and even the general public. And it also involves an evaluation of uncertainties in the computation results that are conducted during the performance assessment approach. So if you want to know more about the performance assessment that's used for low-level waste disposal facilities regulated by Part 61, you can look up New Reg 1573 entitled A Performance Assessment Methodology for Low-Level Radioactive Waste Disposal Facilities. It's a very interesting read, frankly, if you're into things like this. It's well done. It's used by the staff and the staff of the agreement states extensively. It addresses source term and waste types, engineered barriers that can be used in the facility, infiltration that will take place, transport media, dose impacts, and of course, it contains uncertainty and sensitivity analyses to derive how much error is in the performance assessment process being used. So that gives you at least an overview of Part 61, the requirements that are in place today, and generally how it works. I realize I covered a lot quickly, and as I say, we could talk about any one of these topics, for quite some time, but I designed this just to be a primer. I would encourage you to go back and look at Part 61, look at the new Reg 1573. If questions come to mind that you say, hey, I'd like to know more about that, you can always reach out to Scott, and he can communicate with me, and we can see if we can't provide you a little more insight if there's something of particular interest to you that we only touched upon briefly. So the disposal of low-level waste continues to be a very energetic topic. There's a lot going on, frankly. There's a lot going on in the regulatory policy space. The first deals with the disposal of large quantities of depleted uranium. If you go look in the waste classification tables in Part 61, you won't find depleted uranium listed as radionuclide. You won't find uranium listed as radionuclide. And that's because at the time that Part 61 was being developed, the staff assumed that there wouldn't be a lot of disposal of uranium or depleted uranium. That was based upon some information the staff gained from interactions with the Department of Energy. Well, we now know over time that's changed dramatically. Look, for example, at how much depleted uranium there is at Paducah and Portsmouth. And this depleted uranium most likely will end up being disposed of in a low-level waste disposal facility. So the commission directed the staff way back in 2006 that outside of a legal proceeding that was going on at the time to look at depleted uranium and determine if there was a need to modify the regulations in Part 61. Well, the staff undertook an analysis and developed a paper in 2008, it's SECI 080147, in which we determined, the staff, I say we, I still feel like I'm there, the staff determined that, yes, there was a need to make a modification in Part 61 to address the disposal of depleted uranium. So the staff provided 4 options to the commission. The option the staff recommended and the commission chose was to proceed to require a site-specific performance assessment be developed for the disposal of depleted uranium. And that was the big part of the ongoing Part 61 rulemaking that, as I mentioned earlier, is still in the commission consideration. There's a lot of depleted uranium to be disposed of. And what's interesting is when you talk to your international colleagues and you talk to them about the disposal of depleted uranium, they kind of look at you like, what? They tend to think of depleted uranium as an asset, not something to be disposed of. And it is possible that some of the depleted uranium in the United States will be, in turn, used as an asset, but much of it will be disposed of. And so the idea is to put in place regulatory criteria in Part 61 that can allow the disposal of depleted uranium to take place. And there has been authorization already, for example, in Texas for the disposal of depleted uranium. Utah has depleted uranium disposal under consideration at this point in time, while the NRC continues to work on its regulation to more completely and thoroughly address disposal of depleted uranium. Any waste streams that were not analyzed at the time Part 61 was created is also included within that rulemaking. There were a few waste streams that were not analyzed at that time, which are now have been analyzed by the staff and its technical analysis that is associated with the ongoing proposed rulemaking. And the proposed rulemaking also includes a period of compliance. The current Part 61 does not specify a period of compliance, or POC. And for those of you who understand periods of compliance, it's like the old joke, you love to eat sausage, but you don't want to watch it being made. It's very, very complicated. There are technical components to it. There are policy components to it. There's public acceptance. But in Part 61, the proposed rule does set forth a period of compliance. And it's a multifaceted period of compliance because depleted uranium behaves unlike any other low-level waste because of progeny ingrowth, which commences at about 8,000 years and peaks into somewhere in excess of 1 million years. Nothing else is quite like depleted uranium in the low-level waste world. So the period of compliance tries to take into consideration that unique behavior of depleted uranium. That, by the way, generated a great deal of interest by the commission as the staff was proposing this Part 61 rulemaking, and the staff received a lot of guidance along the way by the commission on what its preferences were for a period of compliance. The role of performance assessment versus waste classification table is another big issue today because in the proposed Part 61, recall that Part 61 now contains the waste classification tables, and if the waste meets the criteria as documented on a waste manifest for shipping, then the waste can be disposed of, whether it be Class A, Class B, or Class C. Well, the proposed Part 61 has a proviso whereby a performance assessment can be used versus the waste classification table, or maybe I should say, or the waste classification table. Now that's important because every site has undergone a performance assessment. Every site has waste acceptance criteria, very clearly specified. But what this does is in regulatory policy space, say that you may use the performance assessment or the waste classification table. Now, That's very important for two reasons. Not all low-level waste disposal sites are created equal. For example, the site conditions for a humid site, such as the one in Barnwell, South Carolina, are remarkably different than the waste disposal facility in Andrews County, Texas, or in Utah, Clive, Utah, or in Washington. So the performance assessment may allow, depending upon the analysis, to allow concentrations that are in excess of the waste classification table in Part 61. Now, this has to be married with changes in the license by the regulator, whereby they're not only authorized to dispose of Class A, as is the case in Utah, Class A, B, and C, as is the case in South Carolina, Washington, and Texas, but it can be disposed of according with the performance assessment. And you take a very arid site like Texas, or Utah, or Washington, especially Texas, which is a phenomenal site for disposal of low-level waste. The role of the performance assessment then is very, very, very important. The disposal of GTCC waste, greater than Class C waste, is an issue that's been bubbling since 1985, when the Low-Level Waste Policy Act was amended and the Department of Energy assumed responsibility for the disposal for the federal government in 1987. In the last few years, the Department of Energy actually developed a final environmental impact statement where it looked at the entire inventory of greater than Class C waste in the United States, including the 880 cubic meters of reactor internals that are currently sitting in on pads at independent dimensional storage installations at the reactor sites. And after it completed its environmental impact statement, it has an obligation to communicate with Congress. I don't know exactly where that stands now or exactly what Congress will do. But in the meantime, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission staff has developed a regulatory basis document addressing the disposal of greater than Class C waste. Now, that document did not contain a path forward. It identified several options, but I think when one reads that regulatory basis document, it becomes pretty clear that the staff has the disposal in a near-surface disposal facility in mind for greater than Class C waste. And, interestingly enough, in that regulatory basis document, the NRC staff determined that all but 2 waste streams of GTCC waste were in fact suitable for near-surface disposal. There were certain silt sources are not, and a waste stream from the West Valley site was not. And the last issue that I would mention is very low-level waste. This is indeed a very interesting and complex issue. You might recall that earlier in my commentary I pointed out that very low-level waste is not defined in regulatory language. There's an operational understanding of what it is. For example, the very low end of Class A waste, some waste is disposed granted by an authorization granted by the NRC under its language in Part 20.2002, or in the case of the Waste Control Specialist facility in Andrews County, Texas, the state of Texas is authorized the disposal of VLLW up to about 10% of the low end of Class A waste for disposal in a RCRA cell at that facility there in Andrews County, Texas. The NRC staff undertook a scoping study for very low-level waste and was looking at several options: more guidance, interface with other federal agencies, do nothing, or a rulemaking that could potentially lead to a class of waste known as VLLW. The NRC staff has put that regulatory scoping study on hold for VLLW while it addresses an issue that has arisen with the 20.2002 authorization process, including a lawsuit filed by NEI, the Nuclear Energy Institute. And the staff is currently looking at ways that the language in 20.2001, where waste may go to an authorized recipient, could include a recipient that has been granted an exemption to receive so-called VLLW waste. So all of that is in play right now in the regulatory arena, and we will see what happens as time marches on. VLLW is a controversial topic because the anti-nuclear people, or shall we say people who have a great deal of concern about things nuclear, don't like it. They believe it's simply deregulation because yesterday it was low-level waste and tomorrow it's very low-level waste. But on the other hand, industry practitioners all understand that this DLLW is very low in risk by compared to the rest of Class A waste, and certainly in comparison to the overall waste scheme. So we will see what happens there. But these two, GTCC disposal and DLLW disposal, are going to be going on for some time, and there's going to be additional regulatory policy actions on both of them. I'm virtually certain of that. So, Scott, I think I'll stop there, and if we have time, we can entertain some discussion.
Yes, Larry, that was outstanding. You covered a tremendous amount of territory. Now, you addressed one of the main things that I have preached on for a long time, especially for GTCC. At one time, it was believed that GTC, low-level waste disposals, was not generally suitable for the near surface. But it also underscored the point that the waste classification tables that were developed in 1982 were based on a completely different set of assumptions. And also, it didn't account for how our industry has matured over the past 40 years. And I think you captured and hit most of those major points. And so what I'd like to do is open it up to questions and answers from you for the next several moments. And I'm going to turn this over to my associate here, Leslie Wooten, and she is going to handle the questions and answers. And Larry, thanks a million for your help. That was an outstanding presentation. We're going to be recording this, and this will be a really invaluable training tool for many people to use for quite some time now. So thanks so much, Larry.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, if we could use the hand-raising function for WebEx, I think that might make it a little bit easier rather than talking over each other since we have a lot of participants. I see Aaron White's hand is raised. Go ahead, Aaron.
All right, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Speak up.
All right, my first question is, I know you mentioned several times the update to Part 61. Do you know the status of that? Is there a timeline in the next few years for its completion, and what are some of the big things that are holding up its approval?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. Yes and no. When I say no, first, let me say this. It's been before the commission for quite some time. Part of the complicating factor, I believe, is that there's been a change in commission participants. We had Commissioner Wright join the commission, Commissioner Caputo joined the commission, certain commissioners left. And so if you go back to the days when Bill Ostendorf was there, Bill Magwood was there, and Commissioner Apostolakis was there, they're gone now. And so I think the comings and goings of commissioners has impacted the timeline. And of course, this rulemaking, as important as it is not the only policy matter that they have on the table. So I think that's been a factor in why it's taken so long. Secondly, I think there's a lot of interest in certain of the commissioners in this topic. I think the chairman, for example, has a lot of interest in low-level waste issues. I know Commissioner Barron does. So I think that it's one of these issues where between the comings and goings of commissioners, coupled with certain commissioners having a lot of interest, it's just one of those policy matters that are taking a long time. Now, what's very interesting about it, though, from my perspective, is that we must remember that we have other low-level waste policy issues that are creeping up. This question of GTCC, this question of changing the definition in Part 61.2 for transuranic waste. The commission has directed staff to do that. So there are other low-level waste policy issues coming along, and it begs the question then, at some point, will the staff consider proposing to the commission that, hey, we look at these things as well. We look at all these issues in toto, so we get it all done at one time. If that happens, it's going to slow the process down even longer. If that doesn't happen, Part 61 will be passed, and then these other issues will have to be dealt with in due course. And you can only have so many rulemakings on a given topic taking place at any given time anyway, per OMB requirement. So I think that's what's caused the delay. I think it is a complex rulemaking with strongly held views. And there are other things out there percolating that may also impact how this ultimately gets handled. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah,
Alright.
thank you very much.
Thanks for the question, Aaron. I see Frank England's hands raised. Go ahead, Frank.
Larry, this is a question of state regulation, I think. Scott has taught me that Texas has an anti-dilution rule in their classification regulation. And I wondered if either you or Scott could make any expert comments on that rule and how it works.
Scott, can you please repeat the question?
In Texas regulation, there is an anti-dilution rule.
Oh, yeah.
And I wondered if either you or Scott would have some comments about the anti-dilution rule and how it works.
Well, Scott, do you want to speak to the Texas issue first, because you were very close to it? Then I'll give you.
I can. Yes, Texas, when they promulgated their rules, they wanted to have a rule for the intentional or a prohibition about intentionally prohibiting the intentional blending of waste for the purpose of changing waste classification. And if you do choose to blend it and change the waste classification, you have to classify it based upon the waste class that it would have been prior to blending or dilution. And they did that to align with the hazardous waste regulations about anti-dilution. And Larry, you and I worked through this when the NRC was promulgating or moving forward with the branch technical position on waste, on blending, waste capsulation, and concentration averaging. So in Texas, you can't blend or intentionally blend or mix waste with the intention of changing the waste classification. But that's not the case as to other disposal facilities across the country. And the NRC's branch technical position addressed that. And Larry, I think this is a good segue for you.
Yeah, thank you for repeating the question. I couldn't quite hear it, but yeah, I get it. Yeah, the issue of blending did come up several years ago, and staff in one of our commission papers did raise this issue for the commission awareness and consideration, and the commission put no regulatory prohibition on blending of normal, typical low-level waste. It did say it can't happen with GTCC waste. But for Class A, B, and C, they put no regulatory prohibition on that. And blending, by the way, takes place all the time. In utilities, for example, as they go about putting their waste together, resin beads come to mind, for example, and then it's disposed according to the class of waste that it is. Therefore, blending is an effective tool. However, Texas, as Scott pointed out, took a different regulatory position. So that's blending. The other thing that comes to bear is concentration averaging, where one can take the contents of a waste drum and average it over the volume of the waste drum to determine what class of waste it is. And concentration averaging is an area where the NRC staff did a lot of work in updating its branch technical position and brought to bear much new and extensive guidance on the topic of concentration averaging. Concentration averaging has been used very successfully in disposal of low-level waste. The Trojan reactor vessel comes to mind, which is concentration averaged and disposed. So it's a very effective tool that allows one to average the waste over the volume involved. So blending, concentration average, two different things, but often thought of in the same light. But that's the NRC take on it, and Scott gave you Texas.
Yeah, Larry, the only thing I would add, one thing that came forward with the branch technical position development and you captured this a little bit, that the analysis that established the waste classification was based on the waste streams that were known to exist or that might exist in the near future. But for blended waste, there was not an analysis for waste that was blended right at the limits between Class B and Class A. And the NRC recognized that part of the intruder analysis did need to include those types of waste streams, and that was captured at the direction of the commissioners that when you were at the helm, that would be part of this rulemaking.
Yep, sure was. Good point, good point.
And I think Aaron had one more question. I'm going to turn this over to Leslie, and we got time for about 2 more questions.
Okay.
Aaron, do you have any other questions, or just malfunction of the hand raising.
No, I thought I typed my question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I thought I typed my question. This goes along with that discussion that was just going on, which you were talking about blending. In DOE, we use the term consolidation, and I was wondering if Larry has a opinion on the difference between blending, concentration averaging, and consolidation.
Well, blending and concentration averaging are really two different things. I mean, some might say it's dilution. I understand that. Dilution is the solution, some would say, but they're really two different physical and regulatory processes. The process and the terminology that DOE uses, I'm not acutely familiar with that, but fundamentally, I mean, I can't speak to the nth degree of the differences that terminology means, but fundamentally what you're doing at the end of the day is trying to determine what class of waste it is by using methods that more efficiently allow you to consider the waste as a whole, determining what class of waste it is, and then being able to dispose of it consistent with the appropriate regulatory criteria. Again, I'd have to, pull up the DOE paperwork and look specifically at all the subtleties in that term, but fundamentally, they're not that remarkably different.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. It's all about safely and compliantly disposing of our waste, and most importantly, efficiently disposing of it. In consolidation, I've seen where you have a site remediation area where you have varying levels of contamination, and you pull from a little bit of high and a little bit of low.
Yep.
Consolidate into the same container, and you get a characterization for that particular container and classify it accordingly.
Right. No, that's true. Yep. Good point.
All right. Are there any other questions? Some of the dial-in users may not have the hand-raising function. Does anybody else have a question for Larry? Hannah Hunter?
I would just mention as we wind down, as I say, I had to cover a lot today, given the amount of time we have. It's a very complex subject matter, but, if you look through the slides and you say, hey, I wish I'd have thought of that question or this question, do reach out to Scott and we'll see if we can't, come up with an answer for you, okay? But from my perspective, thanks for listening, and I appreciate the questions, and thanks for the opportunity to take part.
All right. Thanks, Larry. I'll let Scott close.
Okay.
Hey, Larry, thank you so much. It was a distinct pleasure on my behalf to host you today. It was an outstanding presentation, and again, thank you. And with that, I also want to thank the audience for participating. I hope you found it very useful. And with that, I hope that you can participate next week. Next week, our presentation is going to be from Cindy Jones. She works also from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, but also did work for the State Department at the IAEA, and she's going to be talking about international opportunities. And so with that, we'll sign off, and thank you.
Thank you.